I think it's the top of the hour, so I'm going to kick things off and say, welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm absolutely delighted to see you all here today. We have a fantastic guest on a vital subject, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. The reason we're bringing Jarret here today is because the United States federal government just had a major change of administration. Whatever you think about politics, there's a significant difference being felt right now in Washington, D.C. And that has profound implications potentially for higher education. And we have one of the best people in the world to speak to right now. Jarret Cummings is a senior advisor for policy and government relations at EDUCAUSE. He's been a guest before, speaking on incredibly important topics with a great deal of depth and knowledge. I'm just so excited to welcome him back. If you'd like to learn more about Jarret, or if you'd like to learn more about the work he's done, look in the the left edge of the screen. You should see about three just kind of light mustard colored boxes. Each of those will take you to a very short, very accessible, very informative document explaining different angles of the Biden administration's impact on higher education right now. So take a look at those when you can. Otherwise, I want to welcome Jarret. Good to see you, sir.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute delight to have you back. Where are you today?
Beautiful, sunny Rockville, Maryland. Just down the red line from, or up the red line, I should say, from DC. And I was noticing you were calling out some friends from sunny, humid Texas, which is where I'm from. I'm from Corpus Christi originally, which is among the sunniest and most humid places in Texas.
Quite. Joe Murphy just shouted out my hometown in the chat. And how have you taken the metro lately?
I have actually not been on the metro in over a year.
Me too.
Yeah, it's the entire pandemic shutdown. In fact, I was just thinking the other day, I don't know where my metro card is. I'm gonna have to look for it. I have some ideas, but and I'm sure they'll sell me another one. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm the same way. I haven't. I'm on the other end of the metro line, and I need to get on Vienna Station and ride in. And now I haven't done it since March of last year.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the last time I was on the metro was end of February of last year. So it's been a very weird time.
Mm-hmm. It really is. But I'm glad to have you here as a guide to us for parts of this weird time. You've been doing really, really great work. We really appreciate your articles and your thoughts about how the Biden administration is changing things up. And a shout out to John O'Brien, EDUCAUSE's president, who co-authored one of these articles with you. John's a great friend of the program. Always good to hear from him as well. Friends, if you're new to the forum, please know that I'm not going to interview our poor guest. That's your job. My job is just to be the moderator and the MC. I'm going to ask Jarret a couple of quick questions to get the ball rolling. But this is all about your questions, your comments. So if you're interested in copyright policy, which I just threw out there randomly, if you're interested about cybersecurity, community colleges and their free tuition program, if you're interested in the balance between the U.S. government and state governments, if you're interested in particular about the whole challenge around net neutrality, this is the place for you to ask questions. And Jarret is extremely humble. So if he doesn't have a good answer, he'll tell you that. He'll point you to where you can go, which sounded ruder than I meant it to be. But he'll be here to answer your question. So first, I have just one really quick question, which is, the Biden administration proposed a free tuition program for community colleges nationwide. And as I understand it, it's for 2 years of tuition. It doesn't cover fees. It doesn't cover room and board. It's primarily for tuition. And this hasn't passed. It's in the middle of the great sausage-making factory of the Congress right now. What's your take on this? How will this impact higher education? Will it give us a big shot in the arm to community college enrollment? Will it take students away from the rest of higher education? What do you think?
Well, I certainly hope it really opens the doors to greater community college participation. That's one of the areas that we've seen enrollment declines occur over the course of the pandemic so far. But I believe that there has to be tremendous pent-up demand at that level of education, particularly as the economy starts to come more completely back online from the pandemic, and there's probably going to be that lag. As the administration's been discussing, there's still 8 million fewer jobs in the economy now than from before the pandemic, and so that means there should be a sizable body of people who may be looking to reskill to find newer, better jobs coming out of the pandemic. Certainly, institutions, community colleges can really use that funding, and states could use that funding as well to advance their own service objectives, learning objectives within their communities, within their jurisdictions. And the proposal at this time is for $109 billion to fund that program. And I have to believe that as it's negotiated, the administration will try to encourage the inclusion of maintenance of effort requirements so that local and state funding isn't simply supplanted by federal funding, but it truly is additive to ensure that there's greater opportunity.
So the supplanting could be states figuring, well, we have that federal money, we should spend less ourselves on public higher ed.
Yes, that's something that's been an ongoing problem that numerous institutions and groups, for example, our colleagues at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities have really been focusing for quite a while on the problem of state governments reducing their financial commitment to their public institutions as federal commitments, federal funding commitments increase. And so there have been elements in the pandemic relief bills so far to encourage maintenance of effort, and I have to believe that's going to be an ongoing part of federal funding, assuming that the American Families Plan, which is the Biden administration proposal for that community college investment, assuming that it does actually pass.
Oh, that's a big if. We have Democratic control over both houses, but all kinds of things can fall out.
Yeah, it's I think right now the negotiations around the American Jobs Plan, which is quote unquote the infrastructure plan, I think are going to be very telling in terms of what is possible with the Families Plan, and it's, I think, to a great extent going to come down to the extent to which the Democratic caucus in the Senate feels that Republican senators are engaging and negotiating with them in good faith around the infrastructure plan. Because the infrastructure plan is, the way I think of it is that it splits between physical infrastructure and what the Biden administration is looking at as social infrastructure. And the current thinking seems to be that there may be a way to negotiate a separate bill around the physical infrastructure elements of the plan that would get bipartisan support. And then that would leave the social infrastructure pieces to go with really what is almost all quote unquote social infrastructure in the American Families Plan through the Senate's budget reconciliation process.
Yes. Thank you. That's a fantastic. Yeah, that's a great analysis. I think we're done. No, I mean that's really, really very, very rich. Thank you, Jarret.
Sure.
Friends, I have a couple other questions I want to pounce with, but we have questions from you already. So we've got one from the wonderful Steve Ehrman, consultant, thinker, author of a recent book. Let me put this on the screen. The federal government used to have more ways of supporting the spread of improvements in higher ed than has been true in the last 20 years. Might that change in the Biden administration? Let me put that up on the screen again so you can see that one more time. The federal government used to have more ways of supporting the spread of improvements in higher ed than has been true in the last 20 years.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because as part of the CARES Act pandemic relief process from last spring, the it was the Trump administration and Congress at that time essentially revived to a certain extent the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, or FIPSE, which had been a long-running vehicle through the Department of Education to finance innovations in post-secondary education. But they revived it as a vehicle for distributing grant aid to institutions that otherwise might not have been as well funded by other aspects of the higher education relief aid that was provided through the CARES Act. So it was kind of an innovative use of FIPSE as a vehicle for delivering pandemic relief aid. But unfortunately, I don't know that there's been a great deal of thought given to how FIPSE could be revived and better used for its original purpose, to Steve's question, of actually financing higher education innovation. So on the plus side, with what we're seeing in terms of higher education proposals so far, I think there's a lot of emphasis on traditional blocking and tackling resource needs, or such as the community college tuition proposal, a proposal to fund 2 years of free tuition at historically Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions. In the Jobs Plan Act, there's a $12 billion proposal to help fix community college infrastructure to meet community college infrastructure needs. And then I think probably one of the most popular proposals, it's not actually in either of the plans, but it's a stated goal that the different plans build to, which is to ultimately double the Pell Grant so that it actually covers a much more realistic proportion of student need in relation to attending college than it has most recently. So all of these real meat and potatoes types of issues, but not very much at this juncture on more forward-thinking aspects of higher education. So hopefully, if we can get those meat and potato issues addressed up front, then in the back half of the current Biden administration, perhaps if there's a second term, we will be able to see more emphasis and focus on innovation.
Well, that's a great plunge through history and policy, Jarret. You can see, friends, why I wanted to have him here today. And Steve, thank you for a really, really important question. I think we may be circling back to that before we're done today. We have two related questions that just came in, and I want to I'm putting up one after the other, Jarret, because I think you'll see what I mean. They're pretty close to each other. One is from Carly Brady at Madison Area Technical College, and she asks about the reality of some type of student loan forgiveness under the Biden administration. So hold on to that, because then Michael Verduzco at University of Detroit Mercy asks, do you have any thoughts about how student loan forgiveness, and he gives some numbers, might affect long-term higher education fiscal value or funding? So there's the short-term question, what are we going to get out of this? Is there going to be some forgiveness? And there's a long-term question, if we get some loan forgiveness, what will that do to the value of higher education?
Well, taking the first question about whether we will see loan forgiveness, the Biden administration campaigned on the idea of forgiving up to $10,000 in student loan debt. Proposals from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, particularly in the Senate, led by Senator Warren and Senator Sanders, have really pushed for a $50,000 loan forgiveness as the second question, flagged those dollar figures. But I think the issue is breaking down along 2 points, and we'll have to see how it gets resolved in the context of the really multi-trillion-dollar spending proposals that are already in play. I think the Biden administration view is that any loan forgiveness proposal should be funded by Congress, whereas the congressional representatives that are pushing for loan forgiveness believe that the president has, within his executive discretion, the ability to just go ahead and waive or implement loan forgiveness essentially through executive action. and that's why they're pushing for a $50,000 loan forgiveness. I think the problem with that from the administration's perspective is that there's a rather large price tag associated with waiving that much debt, and given the lack of a financing mechanism identified to come in behind that, you're talking about essentially additional deficit spending, ultimately to cover that type of loss. And then I think there are also disagreements between the administration and certain members of Congress as to whether or not loan forgiveness at that level is really not targeting relief to the student, the people in holding significant student debt who really need it. And that's before we even bring in the Republicans. I mean, the Republicans are largely opposed to the concept altogether. So when you're looking at very thin congressional majorities, you're looking at an administration that is trying to push through unprecedented funding proposals. I mean, unprecedented in the modern era. I think it just becomes very difficult to see how you get beyond where the administration started in terms of loan forgiveness. And even then, I think after the Rescue Act, this administration has been focused on making sure that it identifies how it's going to pay for its proposals. And so the funding mechanism that it thinks would need to be in place to allow it to forgive $10,000 in debt is something that still has to be discussed.
Well, that's a really, really good answer to Carly's question, and Carly, I'm glad you asked. Let me put Michael's follow-up question up on the stage again, because that's it's balanced on this. Do you have any thoughts about how student loan forgiveness, depending on how it's done, if it happens, how it might affect long-term higher education fiscal value or funding?
Well, set in the context of the proposals that are out there, for example, the administration, has the $100+ billion proposal to finance free community college tuition. It has a $39 billion proposal to finance 2 years of free tuition at HBCUs and minority-serving institutions. It wants to double the Pell Grant, and so even its interim step that's been proposed thus far wouldn't, the funding that's proposed in the FY22 president's budget, as well as in the American Families Plan, wouldn't take you to a doubling of the Pell, but it would make a significant down payment on that. That's $80 billion. And so you see these existing funding proposals already out there, and it starts to become difficult to see how you would finance significant student loan forgiveness without detracting from those other higher education priorities. And at some point, it's going to be that kind of breakdown. Where are the administration's priorities relative to Congress's priorities, relative to the capacity to pay for them, knowing that you have to keep 50 senators unified to get anything through reconciliation, and if you can't pass this through reconciliation, you cannot pass it in the United States Senate. And then I think there's a broader question there about, talking about the value of higher education that would come from loan forgiveness. I think that the main problem that this issue is really trying to get at, most of the conversation around student loan forgiveness is really talking about the rather small sliver of the student debt population that has really excessive levels of student debt. And the crux of the problem are those people who incurred what probably, what for them would be a significant level of student debt because they never completed their degree. And so in addition to the issue around student loan forgiveness, I think that in order to really capture the value of that, it has to be paired with a really significant effort, which many of the institutions represented here are already pursuing, to reach out to people who need degree completion and trying to find ways to make that happen. And so if we just have the one and not the other, it certainly would make a significant difference. But I think the long-term value comes if you pair it with funding, programming, institutional support to bring degree completers, more degree completers back into the higher education process and get them degrees which are going to ultimately give them the best chance at changing their lives.
That's a very, very thoughtful and sobering way of looking at this. Thank you. Thank you. And that's, again, a really solid question. Thank you, Michael, for this. If you're all new to the forum, this is the way we proceed. We have a series of thoughtful questions from a wide range of awesome people. And sometimes those questions happen by video. So because apparently this day is going to be the day of Texas, I'm going to bring Tom Hames on stage because he had a very powerful question. And please know, everybody, not only is Tom Hames in Texas, but he's a professor of government. So he is in many ways a fantastic person to have this conversation. Welcome.
Can I start singing Texas Our Texas at this point?
No, you don't have to do that. Although I will say I will see your Corpus Christi on humidity and raise it with Houston. Okay, so I'm sorry we win that one. You at least have the sea breeze.
Yeah, but you guys at least have plant cover.
That's a big difference.
We don't do shade in Corpus Christi.
No, I'm out on the prairie. We don't have plant cover either. So
there you go. Yeah, once you get inland, it's all over.
Yeah. So my question is kind of a follow-up on what we were talking about earlier with the funding on community colleges. I mean, there's an awful lot of moving pieces there. Just looking at Texas, as I'm sure you're, aware, being from here, we have the three components of tuition, property taxes, and state funding that all have to kind of go together. Federal funding's a small chunk of that, but it's honestly not the biggest chunk by any measure. Not direct federal funding. I'm not talking about Pell Grants and whatnot, direct aid to students. But what I'm wondering is, looking at the current situation, there's so much variation from one state to the next in terms of the way community colleges are funded, the level to which they're funded. Even in Texas, we have this complicated combination of property taxes. And I don't know if you know, but a couple of years ago, they passed in the legislature House Bill 3, which capped how much you could raise property taxes because the property values went up, which, is the only way that a lot of these institutions were staying afloat in the long term, because people's that's how Texas, despite the relatively low level of direct state funding, has survived. It's because the people keep moving here and the property taxes keep going up. And so that's, I work for Houston Community College, so I know that's where a lot of the deficit from the state funding being cut has happened. So my question to you is, again, a functional one of how exactly do you parse that out, giving direct aid to the colleges from a federal level? Because it's a completely different ballgame if you give that money to Michigan community colleges versus Texas community colleges or Virginia community colleges. And that's, I'm just kind of curious, because I've been scratching my head on that a lot, trying to figure out exactly how you pull that off.
Yeah, honestly, I have not seen very much coverage of that issue, how the funding mechanism would actually work. I think the easiest path forward would be to follow the federal student aid model and direct the aid to students themselves. But I don't know that that's part of the conversation, because then you risk creating disparities between states based upon the size of the student population. So my guess is that we're ultimately heading towards some sort of block grant to the states. And then that will have to get worked out within their various mechanisms, which, is not ideal from a lot of standpoints, taking, as you said, Texas as a case in point, because, editorial comment now here, which I'm prepared to have pushback on, but because my beloved home state's legislature often likes to pretend that it doesn't have to pay for things, we get all sorts of, in a state where the entire political philosophy is supposed to be about how to avoid the heavy hand of government and complicated government programs, we come up with some of the most convoluted funding mechanisms the world has ever seen because we want to pretend that we don't have to pay for something.
So we're not paying for it. Yeah, right.
Yeah. We're not. Well, first we have to pretend that we're not taxing anybody for it. And then we have to pretend we're not paying for it. So it's a really, the Texas two-step from a political funding standpoint is very entertaining if you don't have to live with it. So, you're going to see that, as you say, replicated, I think, across all the various states. California has its own unique and interesting problem, having been the first state to try out this whole property value cap. So I don't know that there's an easy answer at this point. I think some of this, the administration, knowing that Congress was going to want to weigh in heavily once we got into the more social program aspects of its proposals, left a lot of the boxes unfilled, so that ultimately we're going to have to see what kind of funding mechanism emerges from the negotiations on the Hill, assuming we get to that point.
Right. And I have a quick follow-up, which is, you'd mentioned earlier this idea of performance metrics going forward for, judging whether the money is being spent appropriately and so on and so forth. Fiscal federalism also engenders a certain amount of resistance in this state. And so how do you keep states from opting out, so to speak, from a federalist perspective, because there's no constitutional guarantee that there's nothing in the Constitution about paying for education of any sort, much less college. So that's kind of in the states. The only way you can get states to do things is by bribing them, and Texas has shown itself to be resistant to those kinds of bribes in the past, especially ones that may have some sort of a rider that says, oh, by the way, you have to raise those taxes to help pay for, say, things like health insurance, right? So how is that, what's going to happen when half the states opt out of the plan just because, well, the other side thought of it?
Well, that is always a problem. I think this may be different than the healthcare policy space, though, because of the more direct tie that both sides of the aisle see between community college education and post-secondary education in general and economic development. The last administration was very pro what I think most of us would think of as non-traditional post-secondary education, where you're talking about training programs and certificate programs and things of that
Trump
nature.
University.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't.
Sorry.
I can neither confirm nor deny my thoughts on that particular issue. But I think the previous administration was and Republicans in Congress were very supportive of the idea of the forms of education that community colleges are particularly adept at delivering, and so I think that puts this discussion in a somewhat different place. Plus, we haven't really seen yet what as we were talking about what that funding mechanism is going to look like. So if it's negotiated in an effective fashion, that may even be so as with the jobs plan, where if there's going to be bipartisan action on infrastructure, we're probably going to see that split between the physical infrastructure aspects and the social infrastructure aspects. When it gets to the American Families Plan, discussion, there may be areas where you can split pieces out and cobble together a bipartisan bill for some of that, and then see if the rest can garner the 50-seat Democratic majority necessary to get it through reconciliation. And so the community college tuition proposal, because states like Tennessee have been successful in pursuing activities of that nature, there may be a way to get to a bipartisan approach to that. There's already been bipartisan support in the past for expanding the earned income tax credit, and some of the tax proposals where it's cutting taxes or using the tax code to address social needs, that might be able to get some Republican
support. That was a long
support.
time ago. It was a different political universe.
Well,
I mean, you know that the Texas legislature, or the Texas has held up the COVID relief funds for public schools until they figure out whether or not they're willing to accept the conditions that were put on them. And the school districts are screaming for that money. And it's last I checked, I have not checked in the last week or so. The last I've checked, it's still sitting in Austin, and billions of, like $19 billion worth of COVID relief money. So, and there's 3 parties now, not 2. Remember that. There's 2 Republican parties, and one of which is strongly represented in Texas, much more so than the one represented even in DC. So I'll leave it there.
Before we get there, Tom, thank you for those really
Thank you.
Jarret, thank you for a really astonishing display of your political knowledge. Friends, if you haven't used the Future Trends Forum, that's a perfect example of a video question. So if you'd like to follow Tom on stage, again, just press that raised hand button, and you can join us, and we'd be glad to see you. But we have more questions that are coming in. We have one from Christine Shakespeare in New England, the University of New Haven. And her question got slightly cut off, but I know where it's going. So I'm going to show you the first 2/3 and then read you the last part. Do you think there is congressional appetite to allow for some experimental programs like apprenticeships and so forth that can leverage federal financial aid, such as the way CBE, competency-based education, was able to develop? And she had gone on to say that, well, I mean, that's the gist of the question. But she mentions that way a CBE was able to develop with experimentation during the Obama administration.
Well, leveraging our last conversation, there has been great support, I think, on both sides of the aisle for the idea of providing education after high school that will support people in upskilling to get the jobs that are available or that are likely to be available. And then I think you combine that with the Democratic Party, especially the Biden administration's resurgent interest in supporting unions, which have traditionally been major sources of apprenticeship programs. And it seems that there should be a way for a bipartisan deal to come together around that space. And if not, that the administration may look to its avenues for executive action within existing programs to help promote additional opportunities. So it's in some ways, because the prior administration and Republicans in Congress were so focused on the apprenticeship, job training, certificate set of educational issues, that may allow for a discussion to take place now that otherwise might not have been viable had the Democrats just presented it themselves.
That's interesting. So there may be some bipartisanship here in the end.
Yeah, I mean, to the earlier point, there is a history of certain people forgetting that they supported things once somebody they don't like starts to support it. But some of these issues, I think, to the extent that anything flies below the partisan radar at this point, it seems that this is one of those areas that may.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Thank you. Christine, thank you for the really good question. And please say hi to my friends at UNH. We have another question coming from across the country, from Portland Community College, with Kathleen Freitag. And her question is about funding aside. How will the current administration be addressing the threat or opportunity of the digital transformation of public higher education? That's an EDUCAUSE question right there.
Well, I don't know that we have a picture on that yet. It hasn't really been a significant part of the Biden administration's education policy discussions to this point. And I think, I guess when you have, somewhere around $4 to $5 trillion in spending proposals floating around, it's hard to look ahead to a broader policy agenda until you get those items cleared. And then in addition, we still don't have the administration's leadership around higher education in particular in place at the Department of Education. The nominee for the Undersecretary of Education position, which is traditionally the senior most higher education position in the department, there's an expectation that James Cavall will be confirmed by the full Senate any day now, but any day in Senate terms could be tomorrow or it could be 2 weeks. So, and that's just one position, but it's when you still have that appointment needing to be confirmed, then you have to think about all of the other policy positions and administrative positions within the department that have to be filled below it. And that's where you really start to get into the actual process of putting these policies together and pushing them out the door. So all that to say, I think that the administration right now is thinking in broad terms about the need to close the digital divide, ensure broadband access, ensure broadband equity, so that people can get online to participate in digital education in the first place. But where the pieces come from to actually move the ball in the development and delivery of digital education itself, I think that's something that will probably have to come down the road.
If you'd like to learn more, friends, about that last point about the digital divide, some of you know I'm always happy to talk about it, but take a look at the Biden administration's first 100 days article. That's one of the mustard colored boxes on the left. And there's a really good discussion about some of the different ways that could unfold, including research and education networking groups like Internet 2 and the Quilt. Thank you. That's a really good answer. And thank you, Kathleen, for the very, very good question. We have a question from our long-running, wonderful fan of the program, Roxanne Riskin. We haven't seen her puppy for too long, but nevertheless, we'll allow her to ask this question. It's about Connecticut. And she says that the Connecticut college system is to undergo a major overhaul and a merger again. They're looking at the North Dakota's merger mode. Is there a merger framework that you can speak to about these types of mergers?
Well, not directly. I think every state approaches these types of institutional combinations somewhat differently because of the uniqueness of their various systems and institutions. I can say that, besides my day job, I also support EDUCAUSE's administration of the .edu top-level domain.
Wow!
And so, yeah, that gets into, so we've become more acquainted with institutional mergers recently because some of the rules about what we can and can't do in terms of registering domain names for colleges and universities get pulled into these merger discussions. So I can say I'm becoming much more informed on them than I was previously. But I don't know that there's a standard framework taking shape. So much of those processes, well, in addition to thinking about the history and culture of the institutions and the systems of which they're part, then you have to worry about, well, what's happening in the legislature itself to direct how those things are going to occur.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's a federal system. We're going to have lots of uniqueness. Mergers are something that we've been tracking here at the forum for a while. So those of you in some other states like Pennsylvania may be thinking of this. Circling back quickly to your point about broadband, Joe Murphy just shared the good news that the state of Ohio just signed a bill to expand broadband in rural areas using the remote pivot to remote learning is one of the reasons. Joe, if you can find the news story about that, please toss it in the chat. I would love to share that around. Thank you, Roxanne, for the really, really good question. We have a question from another friend of the program who has appeared as a guest before, the splendid Ruben Puentedura. And he asks a question to go back to our earlier conversation about innovation and FIPSI. And he was interested in, is the current setup enough for us for the federal government to support innovation in the COVID world? Do we need more mechanisms, or do we need some other strategy for that?
Well, I think it's, it because of the way the federal government works through the departments and agencies and how that's tied to the oversight structure of Congress itself. There's a tremendous siloing effect in terms of program development and distribution of funding. And so finding vehicles for cutting across different areas to facilitate innovation where you have something that may need to pull from multiple sectors of the economy and the government is just very hard to do at the federal level at this time. So certainly looking for new mechanisms to develop and implement programs that would support innovation that might span different areas, education, labor, health and human services, and so forth. The science, the scientific research agencies like National Science Foundation, NIH. That would be a good and useful thing to do. I just don't know that, given the current way our government's structured and the emphasis, as I said, on these kind of meat and potato issues at the moment, that anyone's in a position to move that ball forward for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. I was going to ask a question about Chuck Schumer's Endless Frontier Act. I loved the way that he echoed the great Vannevar Bush's book from half a century ago, but turned out he just renamed it something much more boring. So I'm less inclined.
Well, that's because I just saw the new name this morning myself, and it is something eminently forgettable, which is actually possibly helpful to the legislative process, but not so great for marking out here in the real world. Right. But the part of the issue there is that because that bill is one of the few significant bipartisan pieces of legislation moving through the Senate, many other proposals, senators are looking for any connection between what that legislation is supposed to do and some of their pet legislative issues to see if they can attach it to that. So it's become something of an omnibus research funding, research security, anti-foreign influence, and miscellaneous bill as compared to where it started as the Endless Frontier Act.
Well, that's too bad. We'll have to see what comes out the other side of that. But that's enough for my questions. Sorry. We have two more questions that have just come in, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to address them. The splendid Doyle Friskney from the University of Kentucky shares this one, a very practical question I think we can all benefit from the answer to. Are there any higher education friendly senators similar to Lamar Alexander?
On the Republican side, I don't know that anybody reaches that level. I mean, Alexander, I think, was certainly a very unique figure in the history of federal higher education policy making over the last few decades. I think the current chair, Senator Murray from Washington, who was the ranking member last Congress, has clearly developed a background and emphasis in this space. But on the Republican side, I just don't see anyone who has that level of interest. Somebody will have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the current ranking member for the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee is Senator Burr from North Carolina, who will be retiring soon. I think one of the more senior Republican members of the committee after him is Senator Paul from Kentucky, who has not exactly been, to my mind, a friend to higher education, at least not from a policymaking standpoint. So at this juncture, I just don't see anyone who quite fills those shoes.
Would Elizabeth Warren count?
Well, from the Democratic side, I think that she has such a broad array of policy interests and emphases that I think that her focus is more on direct aid to students, the student loan forgiveness issues. I could be wrong because I can't claim to have checked her policy agenda in depth. I don't know that she's as focused on the issues around post-secondary education innovation that have been raised by the participants in today's discussion. I'm prepared to hear that I'm wrong because, as I said, I've not delved into that. But just in terms of the broad policy spaces that she's addressed, I think she's more focused on direct aid to students, economic fairness, those types of issues.
That's a good distinction. Thank you. Doyle, great question. And if anybody has any suggestions about senators we should be paying attention to, please let us know. It's an important one. We have time for one more question from the always thoughtful Mark Colbert Wilson, coming to us from California. And he wants to follow up with Ruben's question, ask, what are your thoughts about the California Calbright Community College experiment? If you don't know that, that's the recently launched entirely online community college for that state. Is there anything that we can learn from that? Anything that we can benefit from?
I can't say that I've delved into it enough to speak in any well-informed fashion. I can't say from, as you know, Brian, from my history with teaching and learning with technology and interest in issues in that space, that I'm certainly supportive of efforts to leverage what the online learning space can offer to expand access and opportunity to the extent possible. But I think so much hinges, as you know, on the design and the resources that are put into ensuring effective development. And I just don't know if Calbright's in that space.
I appreciate your honesty and directness. Something to look into. And Michael, if you want to toss in anything for us to look to, please go ahead. I'm just going to flash on the screen a link. Joe Murphy shared this. Let me see if I can do this. A nice note about the Ohio announcement about broadband. So you should all be able to see that link there. Now we have time for me to ask one last question at the very end, and which is to say, Jarret, I admire your intense calm, your analytical keenness about all this, because this is incredibly complex and very challenging material. But I'm wondering if I can ask you about your mood or your sentiment are you optimistic about what the Biden administration may be able to offer higher education? Is this a time where you think higher education in the U.S. may take some steps forward due to this unique constellation of president and Congress?
Well, yes, I think, in a variety of areas, again, so much is going to depend over the next several months on what moves through Congress and in what fashion. But the willingness of this administration and the current Senate Democratic caucus to utilize reconciliation to address the president and the party's priorities, obviously opens the door to the funding measures we've talked about. But in addition, as you mentioned, the previously known as Endless Frontier Act started by proposing $100 billion investment in research and development. The Biden administration, I think it's the jobs plan, but it could be the family's plan, but proposed $180 billion investment in research and innovation. So as we know, given higher education's central role in terms of fundamental research in the United States, that would be a huge infusion to institutions that have really been struggling for adequate research funding for the last several years. So there's really we will have to see what ultimately passes, but what's been proposed is a foundation for really shifting forward the affordability of higher education, the accessibility of higher education in terms of financial resources, and then the revitalization of higher education's research capacity, and really moving that back to the center of how we advance our overall economic well-being in the United States. So there's a potentially very exciting time for higher education ahead.
Well, that's a fantastic note for us to end on. Jarret, we are out of time. In fact, we're a little bit past time. So
sorry.
No, it's my fault for not making everybody stop being brilliant. Thank you all. First of all, thank you, Jarret, for your time, for your thoughtful responses to our questions, and for sharing all of your accumulated knowledge, wisdom, and foresight. I really appreciate it. What's the best way for people to keep up with your work?
Well, so the EDUCAUSE review, which we issue, well, now I think it's completely digital, but that's really one of the central areas where EDUCAUSE, monthly issues new ideas and information. And so the policy channel through the EDUCAUSE review site is where the articles you've seen here are largely published.
Very good. That sounds great. Well, please keep them coming. Keep up this great work, and take care.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jarret. And don't go away, friends, though. Let me just point out a couple of things about the next few weeks going forward. And let me begin by thanking all of you for really in-depth, thoughtful, really, really good questions. So looking ahead, just to remind you that if you go to forum.futureofereducation.us, you can see a whole lot more about our programs coming up. If you want to keep talking about this, everything from state funding versus federal funding to which senator is most interesting to what Biden can really do for higher education, please direct your thoughts to Twitter at FTTE using the hashtag FTTE, or head to my blog. We'd be glad to keep that going. If you'd like to look back into our previous meeting with Jarret and our previous discussions on all kinds of topics, just head to tinyurl.com/FDFarchive, and please remember to subscribe. In the meantime, we need to wrap things up right now, but I wanted to say thank you again to everybody for a terrific, terrific, and very useful discussion. Everybody, please enjoy May as best you can. Make sure you're vaccinated, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you online. Bye-bye.